Welcome to this edition of the CNBC Africa Conversation. Now, Africa is staring down the barrel. The continent is looking at its first recession in a quarter of a century because of the coronavirus outbreak. So we thought, let's find some answers in terms of what needs to be done by the continent and also its partners, in particular the World Bank. So for today's conversation, we are joined by Albert Zeufack. He is the World Bank Africa Chief Economist. He joins us from Washington. Mr. Zeufack, thank you for your time. So,
thank you very much, Godfrey.
I imagine sitting where you are in Washington, watching the continent, watching governments scrambling to try to respond to this crisis. I wanted a summary from you of how governments have responded before we talk about how they ought to have responded.
Godfrey, thank you so much. First, let me say we are living really unprecedented times, and COVID has definitely dealt a terrible hand to the whole world. This is certainly the deepest recession we're going to see at the global level since the beginning of this century. So these are unprecedented times, and African countries, just like any other country in the world, our countries have reacted, quite well, but in the midst of so much uncertainty, it was difficult to just get it right. There's no single country that has actually managed to get it right. So our countries have scrambled to put up solid responses, and we've seen countries like South Africa really implementing lockdowns. Number of other countries in Africa have opted for lighter measures, but ultimately, it has led to a serious contraction in economies. And as you have said, the whole region will go down in a recession for the first time in 25 years. And we are projecting that growth will decline to a window of -2% to -5% in 2020.
Sure. So when you look at how the governments have responded, and with the benefit of hindsight, of course, what ought to have been the response, policy response, I mean, before we talk about the monetary side, just the policy response from a fiscal perspective, how should the governments have responded in the first place, do you think?
Well, Godfrey, we are facing, in most African cases, a triple crisis. You have a health crisis that was brought about by COVID. You have an economic crisis we just mentioned. But in some countries, you also have a potential food crisis. So, this combined is extremely heavy burden to really handle. So with the hindsight, what should government actually be doing, or what should they have been doing?
Yeah.
I believe there are three ways to approach this. One would have been to focus on protecting lives and handling the health crisis. Second is to preserve livelihoods by protecting as much as possible jobs, by protecting households and workers. And the third important pillar of any policy response should have include protecting the future, basically building resilience in our economies, shortening the time it would take to recover, and really ensure that we build our economies to sustain the future shocks. So these three pillars are not necessarily mutually exclusive. To the contrary, our advice is that governments implement these three set of policies together. So implementing policies to provide test kits, to provide PPE to the population and to the medical staff, building or strengthening our public health systems capacity, building their capacity to respond to this crisis are all important. But at the same time, we should be really extending facilities to firms that can protect jobs, that can create new jobs during this crisis. Because what we want to avoid, Godfrey, is a sudden stop in economies.
Absolutely, 100%. Difficult choices had to be made, and difficult choices had to be made very, very quickly. And we did see in some cases reversal of previous policies, and then the governments again are starting on another front. I wanted to ask, so we know, of course, Africa is a continent, 54, 55 territories we're talking about. But have you seen any evidence of a coordinated approach by countries on the continent? Because we do know, of course, as part of the Africa Free Continental Trade Area and indeed the African Union itself, we've got the regional economic blocks. Therefore, any decision to shut down one part of the economy ought to have been coordinated as a way of, number one, as you said, protecting livelihoods, protecting jobs, and ensuring that economies continue to tick even as we face this pandemic.
That's actually a very important point, Godfrey, because our research shows that countries would be hardest hit if they try to handle this crisis alone. And no single country in the world can actually succeed in handling this alone, because this is a global pandemic. So countries that have reacted by closing borders to trade are those that would have the lowest growth for 2020. So it's so important that at this point in time, where the natural instinct is to close in or lock down, close borders, that we take the opposite way and really foster regional trade. Take this opportunity to actually implement fully the promise of the Africa Free Trade Continental Area, which is, from my perspective, one of the best things that has happened to Africa in a long time. So it is important for our countries to really take the opportunity of this crisis to strengthen intra-Africa trade, boost intra-Africa trade, really push for more regional value chains that ultimately will create the jobs and create better jobs, create more jobs, and inclusive jobs.
Sure. So what do we do now? We are in the midst of this. We know different countries have taken different measures. Here in South Africa, where I'm speaking to you from, we are indeed at a very severe lockdown, with some sectors of the economy is still shut down. In terms of reopening, what are you at the World Bank advising?
Listen, Godfrey, when we discuss reopening, it's certainly important to actually step back and say what kind of policies we have been implementing so far that would allow us to reopen in a smart way. Number of countries have implemented a lot of measures from the fiscal side. Fiscal policy has been leveraged quite extensively. Number of countries have also used monetary policy. But what is quite clear here, Godfrey, is that fiscal policy is certainly more effective in this context than monetary policy. Because for a number of our countries, we cannot just emulate the US example of just massive the fiscal stimulus, but we have to take into account the fact that the structural characteristics of our economies may actually prevent some of these tools to work. So as we move towards reopening, it's extremely important that our monetary policy is geared towards availing guarantees and lines of credit for firms to actually sustain the jobs and keep creating new ones, because ultimately recovery will depend on the private sector dynamism. Recovery will depend on government support, but most importantly on private sector dynamism. So our monetary policy also has to be geared towards that recovery. on the fiscal side, I think it's important to also address the issue of debt.
Right.
Number of African countries are clearly not in a position to avail enough fiscal space to face this crisis. And one of the ways to avail that fiscal space is to get a moratorium on interest payment. So for some countries, especially those that are not too much exposed to markets, it's important to avail the debt service suspension initiative. But for countries like South Africa that do have access to markets and raise more funds from the market, it's a very delicate balance given the importance of keeping good credit ratings.
Absolutely. As you said, this crisis has no precedent. So we are learning as it were, as we advance and we learn to understand what this virus is doing. But our countries face very difficult choices. We have no buffers, as you well know. We are indebted, as you well know. And at the same time, we need to find money to assist people. And you said fiscal responses would probably have been better than monetary responses. So I am asking, what do the Friends of Africa have to do? And they, of course, include you at the World Bank. I believe you've got a very big toolbox that you have that's ready to try to help African countries. What are you doing, guys?
Well, Godfrey, we've been working extremely hard, and my colleagues and I at the World Bank have really stepped up efforts to support countries with, first of all, with budget support, with development policy operations that really address the first pillar that I mentioned earlier of providing those resources to acquire, to procure PPE, to acquire the testing and really strengthen communication and prevention to save lives. We have been extending, budget support to African countries to address this issue.
Sure.
We've also been working with African countries to implement structural reforms that would better position our countries to recover in a shorter period of time. We've been working with countries, for example, to leverage the digital economy, to improve efficiency of our economies, and to also ensure that we do the hard reforms. We take the opportunity of this crisis to do the hard reforms. So those structural reforms, subsidies, and those reforms that are quite hard to do, I think this is the time to actually implement them. So we've been supporting countries. We've also been availing, working with the IMF and the G20 to avail the debt service suspension initiative to most African countries to create that fiscal space.
Yeah.
We've been working with different governments to also ensure that we protect human capital, because the worst thing that can happen to African countries is to deplete skills that have been built over the past decades and to cancel off progress that was made over the past decade.
Yeah, I wanted to know if there's like a global sum that you can talk to me about that the World Bank has put aside to support African countries in their policy responses to this crisis.
Yes, we have availed more than $700 million to assist countries across Africa. We have certainly been working in collaboration with the IMF to ensure that the support, as part of this emergency lending, complement ours and allow countries to actually face this unprecedented crisis. But most importantly, I think the effort we're doing is on the debt side, because the immediate, what is quite clear is, none of our countries can avail the resources internally to face this crisis. So really putting the issue of debt on the table is part of the solution, and ensuring that both bilateral, multilateral, and hopefully private creditors come to the table to give a little bit of breathing space to African countries is one thing we're certainly working quite hard on.
Yeah. You mentioned that one of the things that you are asking governments to do as part of the work that you are doing with them is to look at structural reforms. Now, I know that in some countries, when you say structural reforms, it's anathema, and you get all sorts of reactions. Here in South Africa, the moment you say, oh, structural reforms ought to be implemented, hey, sovereignty, you're interfering with how we're running our governments. Have you found any resistance? And I know you have private conversations that are difficult to divulge, but I just want to get a sense of the willingness of our leaders to accept that we are in a difficult spot, we need to take difficult decisions and use this crisis well to recover for 2021 and beyond.
Godfrey, I don't think any leader in Africa is contesting the fact that this crisis is huge. No leader is contesting the fact that this is an opportunity also to do the kind of reform that would position our economies to recover better. And I think when we say structural reforms, let me break it down a little bit, because what we mean is basically is for example three things. One, reforms of the regulatory framework that would allow your economy to leverage digital technologies and other technologies are structural reforms. So that's not just about fiscal consolidation or fiscal adjustment. What we mean by structural reforms are essential policies that will allow your economy to boost its productivity and create jobs in the future. So one is the kind of policies that can really fully leverage the digital technology and the digital revolutions. Issues such as regulation of spectrum can actually allow more population, people who are certainly less well-to-do, to also access technology and boost infrastructure, the digital infrastructure. The second set of policies is about raising agricultural productivity and allowing more jobs to be created in the service sector and in manufacturing. And this could be, for example, in creating the environment for value addition into our natural resources. Most of our economies actually just export raw materials. This could be the opportunity to actually step back and really think through what it would take for our economies to add value to some of our natural resources before exporting them, and in the process creating jobs. That would be structural change. And the third one would be the spatial dimension. Most of our countries have not managed urbanization well. And thinking of urbanization and agricultural productivity as the two sides of one coin is certainly one type of reform that we are needing extremely, very much in Africa. And in between, creating the connectivity between rural and urban areas, and developing also the secondary cities as sources of jobs.
Absolutely. I'm actually thinking maybe one way around this, and I speak as an ordinary person who listens to ordinary people. I was listening to the radio this morning, and there was this young man on one of the radio stations who was ranting on about how South Africa is going to waste money by going to the World Bank, and we don't know where that money is going to go. Maybe let's change what we call these structural reforms. Maybe they'll find better resonance with the local populaces in countries where these things are sensitive. But one of the solutions you spoke about is, of course, the opportunity that is presented by the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And we have had to put it down the road because the leaders couldn't meet and finish off the last negotiations that were required for the July 1 launch. I want to know, you have suggested that we're looking at close to $500 billion in benefits if we're able to get this done. I'm asking a difficult question here. Do you think, one, we'll be able to launch January 2021, and secondly, the political will that will be required to institute the reforms, I'm sorry to come back to the reforms, that are required to enable this is there?
Godfrey, I think we need to give credit to the African leadership for coming up with this agreement at a time where the whole world was actually closing itself behind borders. So I don't think we can doubt the political will from African leaders at this point. It is important to acknowledge that our leaders have actually really taken the right decision, made the right move. And it is good to give credit when it's due, Godfrey.
Okay.
So now, are we going to keep the January 21? I was in a meeting with the AU. Spoke to our Excellency commissioners two days ago. No, yesterday actually.
Okay.
And we all agreed that COVID has actually delayed the process just because we were all adapting and adjusting to a world where there was no physical meeting anymore. But I think there are two things that are happening, Godfrey. One, we are all learning that most of these meetings we used to plan for years and get together and shake hands may not happen anymore. So we cannot continue delaying and using, the digital advances, just like you and I are speaking now. We can actually achieve the same objectives, the same results. So I think the pace of negotiations that was actually slowed down will pick up again soon. Second thing that has happened is the realization by our leaders and the technicians working in our ministries of trade and economics and finance that trade is actually a solution, not an afterthought to the crisis. Sure. So bringing back the trade agenda on center stage when we discuss recovery is something that is actually happening. And I can tell you for speaking to all these leaders that the calendar is going to be certainly accelerated compared to the past 6 months.
Yeah.
And I'm very hopeful that we will be achieving quite a lot.
Do you think we should have brought the launch a little sooner than January 2021?
Well, I think with the hindsight, it's always easy to. It's always easy, but my sense is if we could really implement it on that time frame and really keep that deadline of January 21. It's not that far off.
Yeah.
We will be able to actually achieve results. And by the way, my office just launched a report, Godfrey, that shows that the potential benefit of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement are not just in terms of trade and growth, but they are also in terms of poverty reduction. And implementing this agreement will lift up more than 70 million out of poverty before 2030 if we do so.
Is the World Bank playing any part in trying to get the governments together? I acknowledge the point that you make that the political will has been there, that has seen the formal launch of this free trade agreement. But I'm asking if you are putting any hand in trying to get the leaders to move faster so that the benefits that you're talking about are brought home sooner.
Look, from our perspective at the World Bank, Godfrey, one thing we're doing for sure is to work with the African Union Commission on a number of initiatives that are crucial to this agenda of achieving a single market, the largest in the world. We're working with the AUC on the digital agenda, the Continental digital agenda. We're working with the AUC on trade reform, and we are supporting not only the Commission, but also the newly established Secretariat with analytical work. We're supporting the negotiators with research and tools to actually convince those who still need convincing. we're working both at the technical level, but also at the diplomatic level to ensure that we move in the right direction.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to where we started and talk about what we can expect in 2021, because we know 2020 is a year that we are going to lose in terms of economic growth. Where are you guys sitting at in terms of the growth that you expect out of next year, and where is it coming from? We know East Africa was firing before this pandemic disrupted things, but we know that Southern Africa, because of South Africa, was lagging.
Yeah, Godfrey, you're making a very important point. Before we discuss what happened in 2021, we need to start with initial conditions, right? Entering the crisis, number of our economies were already on the back footing. Number of our economies were already experiencing some form of recessions in previous quarters. Number of our economies were facing the collapse in commodity prices that actually was aggravated with COVID, and therefore the shock of COVID just really emphasized that declining trend for our largest economies, including South Africa, Angola, and Nigeria. So, and those three economies, as you know, still represent up to 60% of our GDP. So it is important to realize that, because of the lockdown, economic activity output is going to be collapsing significantly. But because we're going to be hopefully opening up progressively before the end of the year, we may see an uptick in growth. But it's important to mention that even if you see an uptick in growth, that doesn't mean we will come back to the level of output before the crisis.
Yes.
It may take us 2 to 3 years before output levels are back to where they were in 2019. So you may see a blip in growth, but it's going to be driven by reopening the economy. It's going to be driven by the fact that some emerging economies, especially those in Asia, are starting to recover. And we're already seeing some leading indicators move in the right direction. Containers trade, for example, containers shipments are slightly up towards emerging and developing economies in Asia. And as long as they are linked with African economies, we should see some slight improvement in 2021. And that's why you see growth numbers for 2021 being better than those in 2020. But that doesn't mean we would have recovered, and it would take us a couple of years before we are back to the level of the pre-crisis.
Yeah, and that's when our political leaders are able to make the kinds of commitment that are required, and also, of course, take into account what you said. The first thing is to protect lives, and a livelihood was difficult balancing acts. But I want to thank you very much, Mr. Zeufack, for joining us this afternoon and sharing with us your thoughts on what we ought to be doing on the African continent to get back to where we were. So that's our conversation today on the CNBC Africa Conversation. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, goodbye.